won't happen. In my book, I cover the fact that the world is like, to me, it's like Europe just before the Second World War, where a few learned people were saying, look, if we don't do something about Hitler, we're going to have catastrophe. Most people said, oh, how do we know? It probably won't happen. It'll be okay. Now, that one error resulted in between 30 and 60 million people losing their lives, with the most terrible chaos for the world. We could be doing that again. I don't know if as a species we're wise enough to be able to make a decision about the future when we think, oh, there's a chance it won't happen.
What do you do about population then? Because where there has been natural correction, it has perhaps been because of higher rates of education, the availability of contraceptives, all of those things. And so you see a lot of nations, their fertility rates have dropped to the point where they're barely replacing. Apart from self-awareness and perhaps better living standards driving lower population growth, what are you proposing?
All you have to do, and I cover this well in the book under the chapter called The Girl Effect, that in fact the population rise in modern countries is not a problem. It's actually going down because women are sensible, and you go to Japan, the population's coming from 120 million to 90 million because young women there are just not having too many kids. I think they've got brains to know that Japan's a small country, there's going to be problems with food, and they have a $20,000 baby bonus there. It's just not working. Now, where the huge increases are generally in countries where women are not educated and where there's no health. So what we've got to do is raise the standard of living in third world countries, educate women, and of course allow them to have control of their fertility. You'll then find that the populations will very quickly stabilise and come down.
Well, that's kind of what the efforts have been, perhaps, over many decades. Come to Australia, 22 million it's at now, which is interesting because the last figure that really stood out in my mind was 18 million, and that's probably getting back a few years now. Yep. 22 million it's at. What are you saying about what it should be doing? A geographically large and a wealthy nation, where are its limits as far as you're concerned?
Well, of course, we could have 100 million. I mean, we could put 5 Dubais between Sydney and Cairns as long as we, distilled all of our water using nuclear power to actually, desalinated water to actually grow crops. So we could have 100 million and that'd all be in high rise. But my question is, why would you want to do that? I think we're pretty close to the sweet point. It's interesting, America used to be a way ahead of us in standard of living in just about everything. Now it isn't. In fact, the gross domestic product of Americans is now less than Australians, and I think that's a very telling point. You go over the top of the curve, you go past the sweet point, and we all have to learn, and I love New Zealand. You're incredibly fortunate people. Would you want to put 20 or 30 million there? Well, you'd be stupid to do so. There's a sweet point where you have the efficiencies that you need to be able to provide health and education. Don't go past that. Where's the sweet point? Well, it's pretty close for Australia, I would think.
The growth plan that came out a while ago was talking about peaking at maybe 36 million, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And in fact, the growth rate, we have the record growth in Australia and the whole Western world, 2.1% per year. That means we double at the present time our population every 30 years. That won't be by 2050 36 million. In fact, it will be over 60 million. It'll be over 140 million at the end of this century. And in the time of modern Australia, which is 220 years, at this growth rate, we'd have over 1 billion people. And not even the greatest population spruiker thinks that it'd be sensible to have 1 billion people in Australia. So one day we actually have to learn to run our system of capitalism without this population growth, and it's going to be forced on us anyway because there's limited resources. My book covers the fact that we don't need a new system of capitalism. It will work really well. You bring in laws, sustainability laws, and they'll actually prohibit, just as we don't allow advertising of cigarettes now because it's against the interests of society, we won't be allowed to advertise things that are not sustainable. So all this junk you buy in a shopping centre, that will be illegal to advertise. And for someone like Dick Smith, who's made a fortune out of selling TV games and things like that, that's new, but it will happen, and we'll all be very well and very much better off because of it.
It sounds not terribly like capitalism. It sounds terribly like another C word that I wouldn't have...
In fact, it's capitalism. Look, capitalists would never have believed that we could run with these strong environmental laws. They would say, and they did say 50 years ago, capitalism will go broke. It's like capitalism said it would go broke if if slavery was abolished, it didn't. And if you had laws that were sustainability laws, that you could only advertise stuff that was built sustainably without digging more out of the ground, capitalism would adjust. It's so efficient and so productive. In the end, people would say, it's a bit harder to do than a growth economy, but it's still very possible.
I'm speaking with Dick Smith, the entrepreneur, founder of two major retail chains, and now later in life is turning his energies very much to issues of unsustainable growth and population growth. He has a new book out about it called Population Crisis. There was a big gap between your first business empire and your second one. What got you back in to start Dick Smith Foods?
Well, I was concerned here, and I'm sure you're the same in New Zealand, where in Australia with globalisation, I thought what was supposed to happen is countries do what they're good at. In other words, I was criticised with Dick Smith Electronics importing electronics from Asia, and I said, well, the Asians do the best electronics, and I thought with globalisation you do what you're good at. So Australia and New Zealand would grow food, and the other countries where they have a tremendous number of people to be working in factories, they'd do the electronics or the watches or something like that. But it hasn't worked out that way in Australia, where just about, first of all, we're now a net importer of fruit and vegetables, and just about every decent company, every famous Australian brand name is now foreign-owned. And so instead of it being a 50-50 deal where we own some businesses in America and they own some businesses here, it's virtually all one way, and I'm opposed to that. And so I've been trying to support Australian farmers in selling their food and keeping ownership of their business. It's actually been a losing effort, but I'm planning to expand Dick Smith Foods again, and because I think our food's better from Australia and New Zealand than, say, food from China.
I'm rather interested that the Redheads matches, one of the brands that was lost overseas, you started up your own line of matches called Dickheads.
Yeah, Dickheads, it said we have to be real dickheads to sell all of our famous brands like Redhead matches, like Aeroplane Jelly, like our wonderful Vegemite, everything that's any good, Aeroplane Jelly, everything is sold off overseas. And I said we'd be dickheads to do that, and the matches have become quite famous. The funny thing is we now can't even make matches here.
The Speedo brand's gone, which is quite shocking. I would have thought Tony Abbott was doing his best to keep the Australian image on that. Why does it matter that they remain locally owned? What is the national interest that you communicate to people in cold, hard cash terms? It's
about keeping the wealth in the country. See, if everything's owned overseas, it means the wealth creation goes to other countries. Also, there are other important issues that if the boards of these countries exist in the country where they manufacture, they make decisions, their kids are at the schools, it's all part of the community. Whereas virtually every business we have in Australia, the boards are somewhere in America, I don't know, in some state in America. So the members of the board and the chief executive would be making decisions that would assist the local community. Let's hope they're generous. And so that's the problem in this globalisation. It has advantages. We buy things a lot cheaper. And it comes to, say, airline manufacture, I think we're lucky to indeed have two companies, Airbus and Boeing. But most things can be run very successfully from your own country. For me to have, say, the Murdoch press running newspapers from New York and having the boss in New York completely out of touch with Australia, I think that's wrong. I think newspapers should be run from the country town where they operate from or from the city they operate from, with the bloke who runs the newspaper having his kids in the local school and being part of the community. Some would say that this is like a nostalgic kind of 1950s world that you paint, and it's long gone. Yes, but you can actually have some of the advantages without all the disadvantages. And to me, we're told that every generation should be better off, and why would you keep expanding and growing from generation to generation? But in Australia now, a house with a backyard is almost impossible for a young couple to buy. My parents could buy a house with a backyard 10 minutes north of Sydney, and that's where I grew up. I was a free-range kid. Now we have our kids in high-rise because parents, both of them have to work, and I bet it's similar in New Zealand, hugely long hours, put their kids in childcare, live in a home unit. Well, that's going backwards. And I often say in Australia we spend $50 million a year on free-range eggs so that chooks can have a decent lifestyle. Well, what about our kids? We have battery kids in home units, great big high-rise, and I'd rather have some free-range kids with backyards again.
You've several times put your money where your mouth is. Your love of the outdoors is obvious, and perhaps a nod also to that other business, which was Australian Geographic magazine. You pretty much bailed out the Greens leader, Bob Brown, didn't you, when he was deep in financial doo-doo from his anti-logging campaign? What's been the link with him?
I just admire. People didn't realise before I started Dick Smith Electronics, I was a Boy Scout and a bushwalker, and I loved Tasmania. And so I was involved in what we call the Franklin River blockade. They were going to put a dam on the Franklin River, on the Gordon River below the Franklin, and I was involved in that. So I'd met Bob 25 years ago. The problem is whenever Bob Brown rings me, it's expensive. I've said, Bob, don't ring me anymore. A number of years ago, he rang me up about a couple that were, believe it or not, kidnapped in Somalia and wanted to know if I'd put in some money. It was going to be several $1 million to get these kids out of Somalia. And first of all, I thought, well, absolutely no way. I'm not going to be paying money to criminals. But in the end, a group of us got together, and it didn't cost anything like that, but we got this couple out, and at least they're alive. So some of the things he does for me give me great satisfaction. You
also put some money in behind a campaign for the Australian terrorism suspect David Hicks. You wanted him to get a fair trial. Some of these causes would be seen as being classically green causes. Is that where your political bent is?
No, I'm a ruthless capitalist, and my dad went and fought in the Second World War, so we could have certain freedoms in this country. And in the case of David Hicks, he was this young bloke who went overseas, and he wasn't going to get a proper trial. And even though the media distorted and said that I was a supporter of David Hicks, I said, well, no, I don't even know David Hicks, but give him a trial. And what got me really mad was that the Americans took their own suspect out of Guantanamo Bay. They wouldn't allow that system, and they put their bloke Joe Walker Lind into their own court system with a proper judge and jury, whereas John Howard left David Hicks in Guantanamo Bay without a trial. In fact, David Hicks never got a trial, and in the end, I think he was about to commit suicide, so he signed a document saying that he was a supporter of terrorism. He's now back in Australia, got a good job, he's written a book. I'd love to see him get a proper trial one day, because I think that's the Australian way and it's the New Zealand way. Will you ever unleash all that energy on Parliament? Do you have any political aspirations? No, I'm too selfish. I haven't worked for someone since I was 23 years of age, and if I went to Parliament, first of all, I'd have to put up with all that crap they go on with, and I wouldn't be able to speak as I can. I mean, people say to me, Dick, how can you be saying this stuff against Murdoch? He's incredibly powerful. And I said, well, look, he's going to destroy me one day, so why not have some enjoyment beforehand? And so that's sort of the way I think, and I'm very fortunate because I'm well off. I can say the things that I think are important. Yes, believe it or not, I get a lot of criticism. I get quite often nasty emails about things, but at least it makes me feel good that I'm saying what I think is important. What you can do is get up in the plane or the chopper or the balloon and travel around the world, and there have been some epic journeys. The helicopter flight around the world is, how long does that take? Well, the helicopter flight around the world was my most exciting adventure, mainly because it was done before we have GPS and iridium telephones. See, nowadays, the last 2 flights, I've done 5 flights around the world, all at low level, and it's one of the reasons I think we are affecting climate. I look at the world, the pollution we're causing, the carbon black. I think, how can the world withstand this? But the original flight in the helicopter in 1982-83, first of all, it was when the Soviet Union existed, so I couldn't land in the Soviet Union. I had to land on a ship halfway between Japan and Alaska. That was exciting. Also, it was before the GPS navigation system, so I never knew where I was. I was scared the whole time, but it made it very satisfactory when I actually, managed to get right around the world. We share a love of Biggles books, and he has a lot to answer for, doesn't he? Yeah, definitely. I love Biggles, and I have a recreated Biggles Flying Club at my farm, and I've got a letter from him, which of course is a fake letter, but some of my mates who are pretty dumb, they say to me, "Oh, Dick, I thought Biggles was a fictional character." And I say, "No, look, he's written me this letter from his place in Mayfair," and of course I've got it up on the wall, and it's amazing how many believe he actually not only existed but came to my flying club.
You see, the people will criticise you for ratting on the capitalist system. They'll also say, how can you campaign against limits to growth and against climate change and things when you've also driven your car around the world for 2.5 years?
Absolutely, and it's interesting because I've got planes and jets and things